I'm Jack Griffin, Cup Experience, out on Lake Geneva with Steve Clark, the Supreme Dictator for Life Pro Tem of the C-Class. And we are on Geneva's only floating hotel, the Float Inn, a beautiful catamaran. Being pretty comfortable, wishing that there had been enough wind earlier in the day for some racing. But Steve, I'm just, the C-Class just seems to be a place where there's some design going on in the world of sailing. So tell us a little bit about, about the C-Class and what should we be looking at?
Well, the C-Class actually goes back to the dawn of modern catamaran development. In the late 50s, people were experimenting with catamarans with no attempt to classify them. And the RYA, the Royal Yachting Association, decided to throw some broad categories down so that people could to type form the boats to the minimum amount necessary to be able to compare somewhat apples to apples. So the A class, B class, C class, and D class were defined at the time. The A class is still in effect as the single-handed 18-foot catamaran. The B class morphed into the Tornado, was the last sort of successful development B class. And the C class is the 25-foot long, 14-foot wide, 300 square feet of sail, crew of two boat that we have distilled the rules over the years. So the rules were at most 7 rules, which I just limited. Since then, there was a restriction on Rule 6, which was one person on a trapeze. Since we then allowed the both helm and crew to be on the trapeze, there is no Rule 6, which is as you know, is one of the rules of the University of Woolloomooloo.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
So what we've seen over the years has been the introduction of the pioneering of very lightweight construction techniques, including the integration of aerospace, carbon fiber, and cores into the fabrication of the boats. They're highly weight sensitive, so they're built to the as the highest standards they can have because there is no minimum weight. We've been always very aggressive about making the boats as light as we possibly can. The wing sail was pioneered in the C-Class, and to the extent that I don't believe we would have the boats that are currently being sailed in the America's Cup if it had not been for the work done by the C-Class and the development done in the C-Class over the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, clearly what people point to the America's Cup wing sails and say, oh, we saw that on Patient Lady quite a long time ago, right?
The Duncan McLean and David Hubbard built the control system on Patient Lady, tested the control systems on Patient Lady 3 in the 1970s. So that was mature technology when
about 40 years ago.
Yeah, when I started sailing with them, and the fundamental flap controls that we're using are still based on that system. Since we've added features since then, but they're still basically the same. The addition or the development of hydrofoiling in the last 3 or 4 years has been something that's been operating within the C-Class for years, but never successfully exploited. And so we've seen a great increase in the heavy air performance of the boats in the last 2 years as a result of this, where they've gone from being sort of a 20-knot maximum speed boat to being a 30 or 40-knot maximum speed boat, which is remarkable.
Yeah, that's ripping right along. So let's stay with the wing for just a second, and we get to the foils a little bit in a couple minutes. But on the wing, the controls right from the start, were there controls for twist? When did a trim tab come in or a tab come into the leading element? How about the development of the wing?
Well, the wing, the first wings were initially perceived as ways of defeating the sheet loads on the boat. That the sailcloths and everything else were so stretchy that it was taking enormous main sheet loads to keep the leaches straight, and the boats were just being broken in half by the main sheet tension. We were talking 64-to-1 cascades on the main sheet on a radial traveler, 4 inches high. It was bending at least its height under load, just insanely. I mean, the railroad came through. I mean, you couldn't. I have some of these pieces left from the 1970s in my collection home. You just cannot believe the size of these pieces. The main beams themselves were 5-inch diameter aluminum tubes with 1/4-inch walls, and they were breaking. Okay, so the thought was we have to figure out a way not to have to pull on this stuff this hard. So the wing was originally perceived as a way to enhance upwind performance, and the first wings like Miss Nilex and the first Patient Lady wings were just very simple warped elements, very very simple. It was Dave Hubbard who first thought about improving the downwind performance of the wings by looking at the window of a 707 as it came into land and say, oh, look at the slots and flaps, the high lift devices. We could actually get a higher lift coefficient than a sail and improve our downwind performance. And so in the early days, the wing had its major advantages sailing downwind, where it would actually be more where the additional power relative to a soft sail enabled them to get sailing faster than the wind, jibing through, ice boating through through tight angles and all of that, and flying a hull downwind. And for 30 years, the dominant theme was getting the weight out of the boat. We used to say every can of dog food you throw off the trampoline makes the boat faster. It was. It's been a number of studies that said that was just the only thing that really mattered. So building lighter and lighter and lighter parts was always the goal.
And then what has gone on with the development of the foils and foil control systems?
Well, foils are initially a way of defeating the spray drag and the seakeeping drag of a boat at high speed. The seaplane and powerboat testing has all proven that most compound curved hulls have a very real speed limit drag peak at about 20 knots. And the sea classes we were all sailing were all limited to more or less 20 knots. And you had to figure out a way to break that barrier without giving away all the things that got you to 20 knots. Okay, so if you built a deep V powerboat shape, it was never going to go. You couldn't get it going fast enough to take advantage of that. So that was always an issue, and the foils were an attempt to essentially get out of that by picking the boat up out of the water, and furthermore managing the boat in heavy seas. One reason why foils were so necessary in the America's Cup last time around was partially because the fundamental geometry of the platform was wrong. The boat was too beamy for its length with too much sail area.
Okay.
So they couldn't physically bear off in San Francisco without going over the handlebars.
Right. So the pitch pole in the death zone when they would do a bear away.
Yeah.
Right.
Was, I mean, the disaster that happened to Oracle is exactly,
which was on, I think, their 9th day of sailing the boat.
Yeah. Now
before they flipped it over, pitch poled it.
Right. And that was on a set of makeshift foils. In a place where it does go from being, it gets unpleasant in a big hurry out there on Alcatraz shoals.
Yeah.
It goes from being a this is a nice windy day to being, I'm going to be lucky to get home alive kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but that's also a function of Russell's characterization of the platform of wanting to be able to fly a hull very early in the day to make the boats look spectacular on television, and yet having a great deal of beam were exactly counter to each other. So he ended up with a boat that was not very stable fore and aft with too much sail area for its primary venue. We tried to make this point, but no one listened.
Okay. And how about in the C class? Was the idea with the foils originally just to get 80% or 70% or some percent of the weight out of the water? Or was it literally to fly the hull?
Well, we actually had some studies done years ago that suggested that over the balance of a regatta, the hydrofoil wouldn't win.
Would not
win.
Yeah.
Okay, this was Duncan McLean's master's thesis with Sam Bradfield.
Okay.
Was a study of hydrofoils and a velocity prediction program of Sam Bradfield's foil work relative to the C-class catamaran. And the conclusion was that until the boats were going 16 knots, the long, slender catamaran hull was more efficient than a hydrofoil. The point is that you end up with that 20-knot wall still.
Yeah.
So you sit there and say, okay, until I'm going 20 knots, I don't care. Okay, and then I'm going to hit the wall, and someone who can get over it is there. And the typical things you do to get out of the hull business is you plane, but a catamaran hull is too long and skinny to plane efficiently. It will plane, but it's not going to do it well.
Right.
And the spray drag is going to, and the sea keeping drag is going to just bury it. So how do we do that? And my own first efforts at that were with the curved, what I call banana boards, the curved boards that provided up force to carry 50 or 60% of the displacement of the boat, and essentially make it so that and with a trim tab rudder or a elevator rudder, to take that whole I'm going to die skimming along with the bow that far from going under the waves bit out of it, to keep the wetted surface down, and just essentially duplicate what a planing dinghy does.
Yeah.
Without having a planing dinghy shape. Then the next step was to say, well, we're going fast enough, let's pick the whole damn thing out of the water. And that's been exciting.
Okay.
We're all continuing to struggle with the control mechanisms of gaining that stable flight in a more or less automated or automatic system.
In the C-class rules, there's a limit on beam. Mm-hmm. Now, that includes stuff that's underwater too, presumably.
Yes.
So you can't have your boards canted outboard of the
14 feet.
Right,
is
14 feet is 14 feet underwater, above the water.
Right.
Anywhere 14 feet. Okay.
So if you actually stuck the thing in a box.
Right.
There's not quite true, because the rudders are not in that box, but basically you could take the boat and drop it into a grave 25 feet long and 14 feet wide, and it would fit there.
Right. So on the control systems, what are the, I was taking a look at the number of colored strings on Groupama, mm-hmm. and just trying to decode everything. What are what seem to be the things that people are trying?
Well, there are
with
two
different degrees of success, presumably.
Right. Well, the two primary controls the conventional catamaran foil now is for lack of a better term, it's a leeway coupled foil system, where the tip forms a more or less a V, and this part drives the side force and this part drives the vertical force, and as the boat lifts and makes leeway, the angle of attack on the upturned inner side reduces and allows it to sink.
Right.
So it uses the depth of immersion and leeway to tune the ride height.
Okay.
Okay, and that's been that's the sort of the Pete Melvin iteration that was done by Team New Zealand right away,
So-
and has been cloned by most catamaran foil systems since then. And to make that happen, most people have a control of the cant angle, which is how far the board is underneath the boat, which affects the leeway side of this and the upforce side of this, and also makes this project more more horizontally to get those things in balance. So that will be a control that's manipulated all the time. And then there's a pitch control, which controls the angle of attack of the foil and these are not active controls that are being run all the time, but are fairly passive. We have an upwind setting and a downwind setting, and further there's an angle of attack of the rudder foil, some simple arrangement that allows a fixed foil on the rudder to be swept, the rudder to sweep aft a little bit and provide less angle of attack or more angle of attack of the stabilizer foil.
So we've got the leeway coupling that's dealing with the ride height.
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything besides the rudder wing that is affecting the pitch? How are you regulating
it's just
the
like a
pitch?
stabilizer on a glider or a sailplane. I mean, the stabilizer, if the bow pitches up, the angle of attack on the stern pitches up, and it comes up to match. So that moderates that does exactly the same thing that it does on the tail on an airplane or a glider.
Well, that's where there's been a couple of recent articles in Seahorse where they've talked about this long cycle porpoising as being a problem for the AC-72s.
Mm-hmm.
Is that come into the design equation for the C-Class? Thing about that porpoising effect?
One of the things we have is we have a lot less people on board. Okay, so, and we don't have 3 guys that can pump up hydraulic cylinders. So our systems have to be more inherently stable and quiet. Okay, so we're spending more of our time looking for, the long thing is heave stability, trying to get a heave stable foil system, and that's always a challenge.
Okay.
Getting the long cycle stuff to stabilize out is just, you just sit there and keep working at it. And some of it is ride technique, some of it is
just trimming with your weight, I assume.
Yeah,
just the crew and the helm moving fore and aft.
Yeah,
in and out
that happens a lot.
Trim it with your weight.
In the case of our boats, where the crew weighs as much or more than the boat, a few kicks with your legs. I mean, you can do that to the hull.
Yeah.
And have a fairly profound effect on the instantaneous trim of something that you just don't have the opportunity. You can't get everyone on an AC-72 to jump.
Right.
We're hanging from wires, and we can kick things around quite a bit.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're far more. We're not as dynamic as the Moth class can be, where actually, rocking your shoulders and bumping yourself up and down and doing that will have a real effect on how the boat performs. Or at any given moment, there's much more kinetic opportunity.
Okay.
We don't have that much, but we still have much more than the AC-72.
Yeah.
And unlike I think that's kind of counterintuitive here is that the mass of the boat actually makes some things easier.
Okay.
That the violence of the accelerations on the smaller hydrofoils is much more troublesome than it is on. I mean, the C class is much less violent than the A class. or the moth. It just doesn't get chucked around as much. But on the second hand, it's many times more expensive when you crash it. So
Yeah, sadly, in terms of hours and emotional cycles, I guess.
right.